Hello and welcome to Greenomics, a podcast from Oxford Economics where we delve into the complex relationships between climate, nature, and our global economy. I'm your host, Sarah Nelson, and the Economics and Sustainability team here at Oxford Economics, and together we'll be navigating the changing landscape of the green transition. Each month, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to discuss one aspect of sustainability and unpack what it means for businesses in today's economy. Today, we will be discussing this year's Climate Jamboree, the 28th Conference of the Parties held in Dubai during the first 2 weeks of December. It has been almost impossible to avoid coverage of COP, from the headline-grabbing loss and damage fund to controversy over lobbying by big oil. COP28 wrapped up on Wednesday morning, only a day late this year, with an agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. Joining me to discuss the various updates to come out of COP28 is Dr. Matt Winning. Matt is Head of Climate Research at Oxford Economics and an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the UCL Institute of Sustainable Resources, where he focuses on climate policy and mitigation. Matt also hosted the BBC Radio 4 series Net Zero, A Very British Problem, and wrote the climate comedy book Hot Mess. Matt, thank you for joining me. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Matt, you've just come back from Dubai. What was it like to be at COP?
Yeah, it was very interesting. The last COP that I was at was Glasgow, which is where I'm from originally, if you can't tell from my accent. So this was quite different. No home comforts, but it was, on a practical level, very well organized, which is always nice. I think, some of the worst COPs have been where it's badly organized and therefore negotiations don't go well because everybody's tired or queuing or you don't have enough water or coffee. So yeah, it was very well organized, very well attended. It was very busy. I think it's increased basically over the last few years. The space, which I've been working on for about 15 years now on climate change, has grown exponentially, much like our emissions globally. And it means that, much more people are attending, and companies and, civil society and that sort of thing. So the attendance was up massively, which you could feel as well, which I know people complain about it a little bit because they're like, why does everyone have to go somewhere? But also, I'd much rather people were interested in it and wanted to attend than not. So it's a bit of a balance. But yeah, it was really good, and I tried to kind of keep up with what was happening while I was there, as well as sort of meeting new people. You have random conversations with people, and also attend lots of sort of talks, and I was taking part in a couple of round tables and speaking on an event as well. So it was busy. It's always sort of morning, and as soon as you wake up until as soon as you go to sleep, it's pretty jam-packed full of stuff.
Sounds interesting. I did read on your point, I did read that there are 100,000 people at COP this year.
Yeah, I was aware it was maybe 70 or 80,000, but I wasn't too sure of the final numbers.
Not too many cooks in the kitchen then?
Well, no, because most of them aren't actually in the negotiations. Maybe, potentially people are there trying to influence the negotiators and that sort of thing. But again, it's that balance, isn't it, between you want people to be there, you want engagement in the process, while at the same time, in terms of what's actually happening, a tenth of the people that are there actually need to be there because people need to get on with stuff. I don't know whether everyone else being there is a distraction or not. I don't think there's a definitive answer to that.
Yeah, I suppose time will tell, perhaps. But but going back to the sort of what actually happened at COP, as you put it, what were your key takeaways from this year's COP?
Well, they did it slightly differently. Now, I guess I'm going to kind of cover a few things here that we probably should cover throughout the podcast. The first thing was that they got a big announcement in very early on the loss and damage fund, and that doesn't happen normally. Normally, everything happens at the very end. And so it was quite a clever way of making sure that there was some sort of a success and just doing it straight away so that it couldn't fall apart. And clearly they'd worked hard on the run up so that could happen on the first day. It then meant that there was a good sort of start and a success, and it would be, I guess, seen as successful, but in that sense. But it meant that there was maybe a little bit more pressure on what's actually going to happen throughout the rest of the process, and the rest of the process felt a lot more like what other happens and or has happened previously at other COPs, where you slowly everybody's got very good intentions and says we're going to work together, we're going to do all this, and then eventually it all sort of boils over into everybody becoming fairly entrenched in their own positions and arguing about specific things that they want to keep. So the key takeaways are that it's progress, but it's still fairly slow progress. I don't know if the COP process really allows for sort of transformational change beyond but I'd say beyond probably the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was the one time where it felt sort of like an actual sea change, and that was to do with the way the process and stuff was set up or changed. So I get that, there's some positive steps in the sense that the language around fossil fuels is now sort of embedded in there, which even, there was pushback from during the various drafts, and, the sort of usual parties were trying to protect their own interests.
So maybe just on that point, how has the language changed from this year's to compared to last year's?
So, I mean, there's still references to unabated coal. I guess the thing is it now references fossil fuels, which people have been trying to get in there for a long time. And the problem is that, there's a lot of countries that would like to focus more on emission, the tailpipe, the actual emissions, and then a lot of other countries and groups that would say, well, what causes those emissions? We have to stop the thing that causes them. It doesn't magically happen. So the fact that there's language in there on fossil fuels, I think, is very important. Previously, we had language on coal at Glasgow, but that was a specific type of fuel. This is more generally, fossil fuels in general. But there's a bunch of caveats in there. So, some groups have sort of suggested that it's not quite as sort of, transformational, shall we say, as it could be, in the sense that, let me try and get a quote up here on what's actually in there. So the language is fairly weak now, in the sense that, and not compared to other COPs necessarily, but compared to the sort of language that was in there in the earlier drafts during COP, there were sort of various options, including quite strongly worded options. And then at the last minute, we had sort of a real rollback to what was a draft that people were very unhappy about, predominantly, not everybody, because it was obviously done by, sort of put there by some countries. And now the language finally sort of talks about calling on parties to sort of do various things, and some things which are generally agreed and that nobody has a problem with, like on language around renewables, so tripling renewable energy capacity globally, for instance, and doubling energy efficiency by 2030, which is admirable goals, and that everybody's fairly on board with doing more of stuff. Shall we do some more good stuff? It tends to be a lot easier to get an agreement on that than it does to be, shall we do less of some stuff, especially when that less, around fossil fuels often takes place in specific areas. So the fact that there now is language on there on fossil fuels, there's still stuff on coal power, but there is language on transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems, for instance. But then there's kind of caveats. I mean, even the term energy systems feels too specific. Presumably doesn't refer to other aspects of the economy. And yeah, you get kind of bogged down in like very UN language here about what's actually agreed upon. And then there's kind of a bunch of what I would probably suggest there's caveats around things like carbon capture rates, around fossil fuel subsidies. Again, similar to what was in Glasgow before, something around phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. How do you define inefficient? And then there's also a sort of small addition on the recognizing the role of transitional fuels in the energy transition, which seems to be a bit of a caveat to we can just still keep using gas. So yeah, it very much is. I think the Association of Small Island States said it, which was already kind of our view, was that it was very incremental but not transformational, and that's how I'd view this. I think people were hoping it would be more transformational than it is. I still think we're on the right path, and I think the pathway for fossil fuels is pretty much going to come to an end at some point. It's just the speed of the decline and the shape of it that we're still kind of arguing over.
I guess this whole COP process, which I think we're going to touch on later, but it's all about consensus, and consensus in some ways about compromise. So challenges for sure. One of the things that was underway this year, and I know that you attended some of the negotiations on, was the updating of the new collective quantified goal, which was set in 2008, I think, or established in 2008, to mobilize $100 billion per year in climate finance flowing from developed countries to developing countries to fund mitigation, adaptation, as well as loss and damages. So this is separate from the loss and damage fund. My understanding is that the goal hasn't been realized, but they've now set a new target, which is higher than the previous goal. Is that correct?
Not quite correct, but sort of in the general ballpark. So it was a goal that was set, I think, 2009, that was sort of a random number that sounded nice, that was plucked out the air to help, basically transfers from developed to developing countries. And it's a massive, often overlooked part of this whole process, in the sense that a lot of developing countries, obviously don't have the ability to pay for the things that they're being asked to do, and on top of that are being impacted by climate change, and therefore having to spend more of their government expenditure on even just adapting or coping with climate change. So the fairness aspects of all this really come down to the people who are causing the problem, developed countries predominantly, or have traditionally, need to show that they're transitioning first, and also have to support the other countries. So there's a lot on kind of finance there. The goal was actually, I think, met in 2022 or 2023. I think data kind of just from the OECD showed earlier a couple of months ago that was the case. So it probably has been met now, a couple of years late, which obviously isn't ideal. But things like inflation haven't been taken into consideration around numbers like that. And also it was very much plucked out of thin air and not based on anything. And actually, the amount of spending on the energy transition required in developing countries is trillions. No extra goal has been achieved. So the number's not been decided on what it's going to be going forward yet. There were sort of, and there currently are sort of talks. I think as we speak, I don't think it's quite been finalized yet. I don't think there'll be a number put forward until next year, or perhaps the year after. But we're talking about, it should be 500 billion. It should be 5 times the amount that it previously was. And that's starting in the next year or two, and that should increase going forward by quite a bit. So, we're talking, it needs to go from 5 times very quickly to 10 times within the next, by 2030 or something like that. And that is a massive part that I think is often overlooked. There's a massive focus on mitigation, I guess, from developed countries like the UK, and obviously there is that part, but there's also how do other countries mitigate and adapt as well, and there's that balance between the two of those things as well. Obviously the loss and damage stuff was great at COP28. as a start. But again, the sums are really, really low compared to what's actually required.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, the I think 700 or 800 million of the loss and damage fund is a drop in the ocean of a $500 billion fund for this new collective quantified goal.
Yeah.
What is the point of having two funding mechanisms? Doesn't that just double the bureaucracy?
Well, I think it's to separate them in terms of what they're actually for. One will hopefully, the loss and damage will hopefully be quicker to access and more responsive. There's been problems with accessing the kind of the other financing mechanisms. And then what is spent on mitigation versus adaptation? Again, it's been a lot more focused on mitigation, even though countries would like more money for adaptation. So, there's no sort of precise scientific way of doing it to decide on what the numbers should exactly be and who should receive what amounts or who should give what amounts. That then becomes very political, and as you say, it's about negotiations. It's about sort of trying to achieve consensus and things. So it's hard to move from that sort of idealistic way of showing who should, and I've got, there's studies out there and people have done things on who should be paying for this, but in practice often it can be a lot harder. Like for instance, the US for the loss and damage fund is contributing, I think, 17.5 million, which I think I saw the other day is about 13% of Lionel Messi's salary, for instance, this year. That's what the US are contributing to help out countries that are impacted by climate change in terms of loss and damage, despite the fact that they're responsible for about a quarter of all climate change that's happened so far. Allegedly. I'll put allegedly in there in case I'm not exact on the numbers. But yeah, pretty much. Yeah, so the finance aspect, not as much has happened at COP28. I think it will over the next couple of years. There'll be more push on that, and hopefully there'll be continued push on the language around fossil fuels.
Definitely lots to keep an eye on in the coming years. I think from my perspective, one of the key spillovers of the COP process is just the sheer amount of climate attention it generates in all countries. One example, one good news story was the announcement by Uganda, for example, of their energy transition plan, which sets out exactly how they plan to achieve their net zero goals. And that was launched at COP and spinning out of some of the COP ambitions. To find out more about the impact of COP on emerging economies, I spoke to Karla Cervantes Barrón on the phone earlier this week. Karla is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Cambridge, where she works in the Climate Compatible Growth Program to investigate the impacts of the low carbon shift in energy and transport systems. Karla also works with country partners to develop climate policy analysis in low and middle income countries. Full disclosure to the listeners, Karla is also a former PhD colleague of mine and a close friend. Karla, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Sarah. This is really exciting.
Now, I know you didn't go to COP this year because you've been far too busy zooming around the world advising on climate policy development, but you were at COP27 last year in Egypt, right?
Yes, that's correct. I went to Egypt last year. We tend to organize COP side events. We started in Glasgow and then did Egypt, and then this year in Dubai. So we've tried to make events that resonate with the work that we do in the Climate Compatible Growth Program, CCG for short, and we're taking, knowledge that we have from them.
And how have you found those experiences? I mean, how do you think going to COP and also just the COP process more generally affects policymaking in emerging economies?
So I think it's an interesting process. It's definitely great to bring people together to have discussions and to find ways to agree on commitments. It is also really challenging, because having so many countries agree on what to say and how to word it is definitely complicated. So you see anything from COP veterans that somehow might not think that things are advancing at a pace needed, and people with a bit more hope. So it's really interesting to see those things balance out.
And when you go to, your partner countries, do the policymakers and academics that you work with kind of reference COP or sort of orient their work around COP?
Yeah, so some of them definitely do. There are examples of work that goes into either creating plans and showcasing work to show at COP, or just NDCs and other types of commitment that are, directly coming from agreements made there.
So it sounds like it does spur action kind of on the sidelines, which I think is one of the, well, from my perspective, one of the really big benefits of COP. It's just like spurring action and motivating analysis and so on.
Definitely. Reading so many reports that come out from COP times is crazy, but it's really exciting because there's a lot going on.
So tell me a little bit more about what you do with CCG, and if you have any specific examples you can share, that'd be really interesting.
Yes, so in CCG, I specifically focus on the materials needed for low carbon systems. So that means looking sometimes at industries that are making these materials, or focusing on, the very small components of like low carbon electricity technologies or so, and how countries are going to get them to actually make their plans work. So I focus on this as a research, and on the side in CCG we tend to co-create projects with our partner countries. We work with 3 countries in Africa and 3 countries in Asia, so we tend to gather information on what kind of interests and needs they have, and then pair that up with our expertise. So it ends up being quite interesting to work with them.
Absolutely. And also, I guess you get a pretty good insight into the sort of capabilities and motivation around climate policy development in those countries.
Definitely.
So back to this year's COP, one of the big headlines is, of course, the Loss and Damage Fund, which has 800 million or so pledged to it now. Do you have any sense of how this news will affect policy making in emerging markets?
Yes. So the fund definitely comes from a response, that some countries were asking about for years to have set up. So it's great that they'll finally be able to access some money to deal with these activities. But at the same time, part of the problems are that the fund sometimes needs to have defined guidelines for it to work. So countries need to really know how they're going to be accessing the funds and what kind of reporting will be necessary, for example. So clarifying those steps will be really important. Then being able to show evidence that will go into the plans developed for the fund will also be key. But I actually do expect that as all of these processes become clearer, countries will, find good ways to use this fund. I think managing to do correct monitoring of it and evaluation so that the impact is maximized is essential. And we do, of course, hear concerns about the amount that has been pledged. So being smart about the funds and the amount will be very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's going to be a little bit of learning by doing in this process. So fingers crossed the learning happens quickly.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, another topic on the same sort of vein is climate finance more generally, both public and private sector. How do you think that the policymakers that you work with and the academics that you work with in the partner countries view their climate financing needs and the potential role of developed countries like the UK or the US to address gaps in climate finance needs in emerging economies?
Thanks. So climate finance is essential because there are many measures that countries may identify as something they need for changing the systems as needed, say, electric vehicles or renewable technologies. So if those, again, similar to before, if those processes are clear, then they'll be able to access it. And some things that some other like developed countries are doing is set up ways to access those funds together. So something we do in the program is sometimes work on what we call capacity building. So really helping to make sure countries are making plans that will actually lead to, to lower emissions, for example, but at the same time that are useful for financing and following some guidelines. So as an example, there's this approach that CCG has been championing, which is called data to deal, where through help in setting up some scenarios in Costa Rica in this case, there was a mobilization of funds, in this case $2.4 billion, to then work in creating those low carbon transition scenarios. So I think this role of helping with some of the capabilities required, in our case, we help with making models accessible, is essential, and this is something that some developed countries can definitely help with. It's not just committing finance, which is clearly very important, but this technical assistance is very valuable as well.
Thanks. I guess that hadn't really occurred to me that much, but that is an essential role and one that you're doing at CCG, I suppose. So thank you so much for joining me today, Karla, and really hoping to have you back on for a deep dive in some of the emerging market policy making that you've been looking at CCG. But again, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Sarah. It was a pleasure.
Now, back here in the room with Matt Winning, I think it's worth reflecting on something we touched on earlier, actually, which is the COP process more broadly. These aren't new. We've had 30 of these enormous conferences to huge cost or increasing cost, both sort of monetary and on an emissions basis. And our global greenhouse gas emissions are still tracking up. Can COP really move the needle on climate change?
Almost 30. We're not 30. 30 is going to be in Brazil.
Is it? Almost 30.
Almost 30.
Rounding up.
We're just rounding up too much there. So I think the main thing to say on that is that the United Nations process is the slowest process you could possibly imagine coming up with, because it requires consensus from however many parties there are, 192 or something like that. I can't remember exactly. So it's always going to be really slow. And I think people expect maybe a little bit too much of it at times, because actually the speed of things, it can set the tone for what needs to happen elsewhere in processes that can be much faster. So I think it's best to view it as the sort of most slow moving, boring version of climate action, and actually everything else is going to be quicker and more responsive and more efficient and all that sort of stuff. So there's almost, to me, a bit too much pressure on COP, or people don't quite understand what its purpose is. It can be quite transformational. Again, the Paris Agreement, that was about the kind of ambition and the way that things were done to get everybody on board. And now that we have that process, I don't know quite what the next big transformational change will be, but the possibilities are still there. It's just, as I say, it's difficult when you've got lots of countries with different needs, different views. You've got countries who really want to push fast but are wealthy and able to afford it. You've got countries that want to push fast but they want the finance there to be able to help them to do that. You do have countries that don't want to push particularly fast because they're reliant on, I think they haven't diversified their economy or whatever away from fossil fuels. And then you've got, a couple of examples, like Colombia came out this year as an example of a country that are currently dependent on fossil fuels, but are actually planning on adjusting away from that and showing what I would call real leadership, which is taking a harder position to take, or something that's more difficult to do and sell, but knowing that they're doing it for the right reasons and going for that and showing what's possible. Something that the UK should very much be doing with its oil and gas licenses, and you do have to make conscious decisions to do that. Now that's never going to necessarily change for everyone at the same time, and but I think things are moving in terms of the language around fossil fuels and the sort of the specifics of what's talked about at COP. Some of the language has actually moved quite quickly for a UN process, even though it seems really slow and boring to people. But in a practical sense, in real life, it's not moving anywhere near as quickly enough as the science shows us. And often even the language within the COP texts and stuff says, oh, we recognize the science, we recognize that it says this, and then they completely sort of contradict themselves in the following paragraphs where they give all sorts of caveats of ways to get it out. So there's sort of a general recognition of what has to be done, but getting consensus is close to impossible. And that's why the other processes are really important, because you need bilateral agreements, you need sectoral agreements, you need sectoral agreements or industries to take their own initiative and do things across countries. You need cities, you need all that sort of stuff, finance industry as well, to start really taking ownership for themselves. I think there's a lot of expectation that some process will come in or some regulation will come in that will do things for us, and occasionally that happens, but actually taking the lead, being brave, being leaders is the way to impact climate change. If you're out there and you're in a company, setting short-term targets, for instance, that's science-based targets, is the best thing you can possibly do. And it might be tricky. There might be not enough data for you to know how to do that, but starting that process and not necessarily putting it off till 2050 or whatever. It's about starting a journey, knowing where you're heading, but actually the next few years of decision making, kind of putting processes in place to try to check your own transition, and try to not your whole way of doing business or whatever doesn't necessarily need to be changed. You just need to try to fit climate change into something that a process that or a new process, and also keep monitoring it.
I suppose that in some sense that kind of fits under the COP sort of long-term view, because a company will have a decision-making horizon of 5 or 10 years max, and the COP then sets out the 2050 or the 2100 goal. So that is valuable. I guess one question on that is, some countries and some companies even are so dominant in sectors like cars, for example. I think the EU, China, and the US make up like a vast majority of the car market. Would they not be better placed to just come together and make an agreement that those three jurisdictions and not bother with COP? Basically, why bother with this whole enormous process?
Well, one of the main reasons is because you need everybody's voices to be heard. I think the most humbling and important parts of being at COP is hearing voices that we often talk about, or that are often alluded to but are not actually heard, or people are speaking for other people, and actually having those voices talk about the situations they're going through, whether it is some of the small islands or whatever, or sub-Saharan African countries on the forefront of climate change. Their voices need to be acknowledged, and they need a seat at the table, and this COP allows that. And there's still the power dynamics are still there in terms of the text. We can definitely see that even with this text. So it's not necessarily that that's always reflected in what comes out of COP, but you do need people's voices to be heard, and always the case. That needs to always be the case. Doing away with it and just being like, oh, we'll just sort it out as the sort of rich, developed. We're too, smart enough to do this ourselves. That is not the way to solve something properly. But saying that, you could have, the car industry could put aside its differences, and that's not those countries, but just the companies can decide together to work together to solve something. We've seen that quite a bit actually within the shipping industry. I saw some presentations from them at COP28, and they're really moving forward as a sector in terms of trying to decarbonize what they do. And is a really hard one, because obviously it is a global industry, and it might be based in lots of different places, but needs sort of the whole world and ports everywhere to kind of buy into it. So it is absolutely possible if sectors and the big players in those sectors take responsibility, put their competitiveness aside for good reason, and come together to make almost global decisions about how that sector will move forward. And anyone that does try to undercut them or whatever, will feel the pain of doing so, potentially by I guess not being trusted and all that sort of stuff. So you can find ways around it, and those sorts of things. Those are give me a bit of hope when you do see industries actually working together. But it needs to happen a lot more and a lot quicker.
Yeah, I guess that is the takeaway. The core takeaway from COP is we need more and we need it quicker. And that's probably been the core takeaway from the last 28 COPs or whatever we're at.
Yeah, you're probably right. Again, we need more transformational change, and the COP process is quite incremental, but you do see transformational change happening in specific places, in certain industries or whatever, but it's not happening in enough areas. Finance, for instance, it's not happening properly. It's very much seen as an additional thing or something that we need to move more into, when in actual fact what you need is something in place you either need something in place that regulates it so that you have the flows going from essentially dirty industries to clean industries, and that can either be done internally, again by an industry coming together and deciding to do it, or it can be done by regulation. And it's hard because you don't necessarily, there are people that are assuming things will continue the way they are, or have vested interests in things not being transformational. And transformations tend to hurt somebody and benefit society and other people a lot more. But there has to be a bit more transformational change that requires a lot more, what would you call it? Just bravery, I think.
Gusto, maybe.
Yeah, and people, and driven by people and by companies themselves.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can hope for that next year at COP.
We can. I wouldn't bet my
life-saving
horse on it.
Well, fingers crossed anyway. I think we'll have to wrap up there, Matt. And unfortunately for you, we don't have time for a Greenomics gamble today. I know you're devastated.
Oh, some sort of Christmas quiz this time? No, unfortunately not.
Yeah, unfortunately not for you today, Matt. But all that's left to do is say thank you, Matt, and also our phone-in guest, Karla, for joining me today on the show.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to the listeners for tuning into this episode. Happy holidays, everybody. Enjoy the break and enjoy the break from COP News. And we'll be back in the new year. Please do subscribe on Spotify, SoundCloud, or on our website. And feel free to write to us at podcasts@oxfordeconomics.com. That's it for today on Greenomics from Oxford Economics, where we know that money might make the world go round, but sustainability makes it a much nicer place to live. See you next time.